event like this is we've asked Bessa to give an overview maybe for the first 5 or 6 minutes of this discussion to lead in and to really pick up the initial trend that Jason talked about, which is really the challenge that we have within Australia particularly and developing markets generally about slowing growth, and how do we actually look to work with the retailing industry as to how we actually drive sales. So Bessa, if I could hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Sue. Well, I think, Jason, you actually stole my line because the really big theme, I guess, globally and domestically is this low growth, low inflation story. The global economy remains in recovery, but it is still very fragile. What we've seen ever since the GFC, and the GFC happened some time ago, is that global growth continually disappoints. So at the start of one year, we think growth's going to be here, and at the end of the year, it's revised down to be somewhere here. So the IMF, who are the best predictors of world growth, they think growth will be at 3.4% next year. The reality is it'll probably be a bit lower than that, and even at 3.4%, you're still a little bit below the long-term trend, but you are improving. We've got low interest rates across all the major economies in the world. We've even got negative interest rates in some economies, so that just adds to that picture that the world economy is still in a bit of a fragile place. I guess the one economy that is going in a bit of a different direction is the United States. It has started to raise rates. It's only done it once, which was last December. We've been waiting all this year for the next one. It's probably going to happen in December. We'll probably have 2 more next year. If we don't get 2, it'll be 1 more next year. So that obviously has an implication for long-term bond yields, which does feed into commercial property. Even though they're raising rates, it will be a very gradual story. They are going to take it very cautiously, even though they've got an unemployment rate of 5%, which is quite low. The number of people that are participating in the labour force has been falling, so that suggests there's a bit of slack in the US labour market, and they'll just take that role quite cautiously. So I still think you're going to be in an environment of low bond yields, so you're still going to have that sheer weight of money moving into commercial property. The other key trend I think that's noticeable, and you've also touched on that, Jason, is that there are a number of transitions happening in the world, and the first one I want to touch on is the digital revolution. So that is moving quite quickly. You are seeing the Internet of Things taking off, so my smart coffee cup knows my coffee order and my banking details. The world is becoming more networked. What does that mean for economics? Well, you have seen the shared economy take off. So think of Airbnb, Airtasker, Car Next Door. What does that mean for policy? Well, we're making better use of existing goods and services. So you could argue we don't actually need to produce as many new goods and services, and that has a more muted impact on prices. And remember, interest rates around the world are driven by inflation targets and where prices are. And we are in this world where prices do remain low. The other big thing is that the traditional measure of measuring economic activity is gross domestic product, or GDP. That was developed back in the 1940s when manufacturing was a big part of the economy. Now what we're seeing is that the digital innovation is more and more a part of the economy, but that doesn't really get picked up as much by GDP. Yet that remains a key input into policy making. So perhaps the world is changing, and maybe even policy isn't going with it. The other big change, of course, is demographics, which you've mentioned. This year, for the first time, the combined working age of the developed world will fall for the first time since 1952. The working age population of China has already peaked back in 2012. So it will be the first major economy that will actually grow old before it even gets rich. And of course, as the world ages, what people buy and what they demand does change as well. Now, the world population is set to grow by 1/3 to 9.7 billion by the end of this decade. 99% of that increase will come from the developing world. And that's also where internet penetration rates are very low and where there's a lot of potential, I guess, for the digital revolution really to take hold. And then you've got the digital revolution speeding up globalisation. But what you're seeing is a bit of a backlash against that. So what I want to touch on is, take Brexit, for example. That can be viewed as a vote by the British against further integration. That's obviously clouded the outlook for Europe, and Europe's probably my least favourite region because you've also got non-performing loans that are quite high in the banking system there. And then if you look at Trump versus Clinton, Trump is running on a platform that is around more insular policies like building walls around the country. He's the first nominee since 1952 never to have held elected office. So that highlights that there is growing discontent with globalisation, a key theme, which the digital revolution is sort of feeding into. Then you've got other transitions which are taking place. Don't forget there's China. It's still moving from heavy industry to consumption and services. That seems to be going reasonably well, but you do have risks from rising debt levels and the fact that return on equity is less than the cost of capital in China. In Australia, we're also in transition. We've come out of the biggest mining investment boom in nearly a century. I think if you look at our growth rate, which is running just a bit below trend, we're managing that rebalancing quite well. That's been helped by residential construction, infrastructure and exports, but it's not without risks on the horizon. Our cash rate sits at 1.5%. We do think the Reserve Bank will take it down to 1% over the next 12 months, so 2 more rate cuts. The new Reserve Bank Governor, Philip Lowe, has said that they now aim to keep inflation 2 to 3% on average over the cycle, rather than being over the cycle, over time. So he's essentially tweaked words, which suggests that the hurdle for another rate cut is much higher. However, given that we've got inflation running well under the target band, and it looks like that will continue for quite some time, and also head into 2018 and you will have residential construction growth slowing more sharply, then I think you are going to see more rate cuts come into the focus. In terms of the currency, which obviously has continued to attract foreign investment into retail commercial property, we expect a slightly weaker Australian dollar over next year. We've got it at 72 US cents by the middle of next year. So not sharply lower from where it is at the moment, but probably enough to still encourage that foreign investment into Australia. Now, I've talked quite a bit. I'm going to stop talking because I can just keep going on, and I'll just let you take some more questions.
That was great. So, David, maybe turning to you as a retailer, how do you take all of that and overlay it into how you're thinking about your business?
We've been in business now. We brought the brand to Australia approximately 5 years ago. We've got 9 shops. Average size of those shops are anywhere around 1,500 metres to 2,000 metres. We just recently did a deal with Myer. Myer bought 25% of our business, and we've just opened 16 concessions throughout Myer. We've probably got another half a dozen of those to go. So that pretty much, in terms of our growth, we've pretty much covered Australia. I know Steve from Adelaide here thinks we haven't, but that's a whole nother subject too, and that's where we get into things like population and all these sort of things. So we're consolidating now.
Yeah.
One thing that was talked about before that I do disagree with a little bit. It's not about people wanting people might want things cheaper, but they're not going to get them cheaper from us. We're a different model. We don't want to get down there with Primark. We don't want to get down there with H&M. They're selling $7 garments. Topshop is all about fashion. It's all about a look. And if you can create the look and create the style, people will pay for that. Well, I'm not saying we're in an expensive category, but we're very comfortable where we are. And we certainly don't want to get down there and dirty with Primark.
But it's interesting when you look at, say, the number of stores you're talking about, and then obviously the model for Pepkor, which I assume you get your scale, you can obviously work your pricing. Because how do you make money out of a $7 garment?
You do need scale for it. I mean, it's a trite answer, but you listen to your consumer. Because the consumer who lives, I'm going to say in the western suburbs of Sydney or the western suburbs of Melbourne, etc., they really are on a tight budget, and they're really prioritising, especially the mother, who gets the priority in the household, and so they are making trade-offs all the time. And when you listen to the trade-offs, you realise actually they only want the school closed to last one term. So we can engineer it to last one term, but not 4 years.
Yeah.
And if you do that, you hit a different price point. And it actually doesn't affect what she wants. You're actually giving her exactly what she wants.
Yeah.
So it's about construction, it's about the sourcing location, and then it's really about volumes, because manufacturing is reducing around the world, but if you go to Bangladesh or you go to China, you go to Vietnam, textiles is a big manufacturing industry, and we all know manufacturing runs on economies of scale. So if you can tie up a line for an entire year, you get lower prices.